Stedman podcast. Thank you so much for listening to this wonderful podcast. We've been talking a lot about spirituality and kind of the things that have been going on in our culture. And today we're going to be talking about sex in the church. And one of the people that I'll be interviewing is someone who was on some of my original first podcasts many, many years ago, Cailee Krieger. So Kaylee, welcome back to the show. It's been a while.
I know. Too long. Too long.
So too long. So since it's been a while, why don't you kind of let everybody know, kind of those are our old listeners, kind of get to know you a little bit more to kind of reconnect with you, and some of our new listeners, like Cailee Krieger.
Well, I am a mom of two currently, with one that is due in 2 weeks.
All right.
So, motherhood is like my full-time job. I stay home full-time with them, and I homeschool my older two, Natalie and Sawyer. I'm married to Nick. We've been married, 8 years. Yeah, we just had 8 years celebration. And let's see what else. I went to AU. I think we've got some overlap there, not in our time, but AU alum.
Yeah.
And I worked there for a little while. But basically we had kids pretty early in our marriage. So I've basically just been staying at home for the past 6 years with my kids. I love it.
Great. So obviously when I've been kind of putting feelers out for some of these topics, you were one of the ones who said, hey, I would like to talk about that, because I've been having conversations with some of my friends and some people at church. So why is it that when we talk about sex in church, why is it that that's not only an interesting topic now to kind of talk about as an adult, but why was it so taboo for us growing up, in your opinion?
Taboo growing up. That's a good question. I think maybe one of the reasons is that people don't know how to talk about it without feeling awkward or feeling like they are sharing too much or getting into a subject that makes people feel uncomfortable. We don't like to feel uncomfortable. And so I think maybe that's one of the big reasons. And also I think there's a lot of different views of how to approach it, how to discuss it. And that might be one of the contributing factors of why it's a hard subject to talk about in the church.
Yeah. And, I was even thinking about, the idea of, the conversation, having this sex talk. I can remember from growing up, I probably might have been like 7th grade, maybe even 6th grade. I remember my dad walked into my room and was just like, hey son, we need to talk. And I thought I was in trouble. And then he started talking to me about sex, and I was not ready. I mean, I think I tuned out in that whole entire conversation. And like you said, it was very awkward. So what was your experience of, within your home? Was sex ever talked about in your home?
Yeah. I don't know that it wasn't something that was like an open conversation. It wasn't something where my parents were like, if you do this, this is what happens, blah, blah, blah. Whenever we had my version of the sex talk was my mom giving me a book with all the information about what happened. It was from a Christian perspective, and saying, here's this book. I read through it in a day because I love reading and love information. And she was like, let me know if you have any questions. And I don't know that I can't really remember the time if I had questions, but I feel like even though my parents were like, if you have questions, ask us, I don't feel like I was feeling comfortable enough with them that I would have asked questions even if I did, because it was something that was like, this is this one time that we're discussing this right now, so we can check it off that I had the conversation with you, And I don't think that was a bad thing. I think that was just probably better than their parents did. They were trying to do a good job, and that was the best that they could offer.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because even just, thinking about my parents, I mean, my dad talked to me and I never heard anything from my mom about it.
Yeah.
And I feel like, like your mom talked to you about it, but I don't think your dad ever did. How,
No.
how, how do you remember how old you were when you got that book?
I had to have been, I'm sure it was before, like we had the sex talk at school in 6th grade. So I'm sure it was before that. They wanted to get their information in before we had the sex talk at school. So I was probably maybe 5th grade, I would guess.
Okay. And yeah, so obviously I mean, I think this is a conversation I was having with Melissa, just like, sometimes it's almost like, well, I wasn't ready to have that conversation because I wasn't thinking about dating or girls or anything till I
Right.
was much older, like almost like in high school, probably maybe sophomore, maybe even juniors when I started to kind of be more interested in dating. But no, like, so obviously having that conversation like in 5th or 6th grade, you're just like, nope, I'm
Yep.
not having this conversation. So, so I mean, so kind of the consensus is, at least from my experience, your experience, and also Melissa's experience, has been kind of this idea of parents kind of trying to do the best they can because, probably when they were teenagers, I'm sure it was probably something that wasn't really talked about, something that
Right.
wasn't really communicated. At the same
Right.
time, I think maybe in some cases it seemed like even when it came to church when they were growing up, I'm sure that was something that was never discussed in the church.
For
So
sure.
from your experiences being in church, what was your experience as far as teaching on sex, and not only just within church but even conferences, camps?
Yeah.
What was that? Was that something that was communicated clearly, or how frequently was that talked about?
Um, as far like I see a lot of overlap in my parents' discussion of it and the church discussion of it. A lot because my parents were youth leaders. So,
Yeah.
they were a part of those conversations or a part of those studies that we did whenever we would talk about sex at church. Um, Obviously, most of the emphasis was on staying abstinent. That was like the biggest thing that was communicated about sex. Not really, not sex education, like how it was happening, but it was just basically all stay abstinent. That's the one true way to be a good Christian.
Mm.
We in our youth group, usually we would split up guys and girls to have conversations. And once a year in February during Valentine's, we would have what was referred to as LSD, our love, sex, and dating talk.
Mm.
So we would split up guys and girls and talk about these things. And obviously, I don't know what was happening in the guys' conversation, but for us, the emphasis was on being daughters of the king and focusing on purity culture.
Okay. Yeah. See, and actually, that sounds a lot better than my experience because I don't even remember hearing much about sex being talked about in church.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, especially growing up in youth group, I never heard anything. It seemed like the only time I heard stuff about sex would have been at like a camp or a conference. Like I can
Right.
remember back in '96, I was just entered into youth group and they took us to IYC 96 in Phoenix, Arizona. And I don't know who the speaker was, but I remember they passed out these cards that basically, I don't know if they were covenants or if they were like contracts or what it was, but it was basically me writing my name and
Yes.
saying that I signed it saying that I am going to remain pure until marriage.
Yeah.
And
As
that
your
was kind of,
abstinence driver's license.
yeah. And abstinence, right? See, well, the interesting thing about my experience at church is like that wasn't communicated, but I think it was because I remember like 5th grade was when, I think for me, 5th grade, we had someone come in for, I think it was from Planned Parenthood, 2 weeks talking about sex. It wasn't until 8th grade where that's the first time I ever heard the word abstinence. And
Oh,
I, and you know, as much as people like to say, oh, Planned Parenthood was bad, this lady who came in handed all of us mirrors. And I remember this, mirrors in like these gel cases. And there was a big heart on it. And it said, abstinence is freedom. And this lady, I mean, she talked about contraceptives, sexually transmitted disease, pregnancy, safe sex, everything else. And she even talked about like kind of like the psychological aspect of sex too. And she even said, you know, out of all these things, you know, you can use all these contraceptives, but if you want 100% be sure you do not get pregnant, a disease, anything else, abstinence is the way to go. And that was the first time I ever heard that in a public high school from Planned Parenthood was when I heard that.
Wow.
And I thought that was fascinating. And then you get to the church where it seemed like it was, you know, be pure, which we'll talk a little bit about that with purity culture, because I know that's been a big sticking point recently, or have seen recently. But it was like, you know, and I felt like on my end, because it's interesting that you said that they were splitting up, because I feel like that was very typical. Girls in one room, guys in another room.
Right.
But I felt like from a guy's side, especially like in some of these conferences or even camps, it was almost kind of made like that men are these Neanderthal sexual creatures.
Oh, for
that
sure.
All we do is anytime we look at a woman, only thing that's going through our head is sex, 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 boobs, boobs, boobs. And that's pretty much it, which, you know, that was always a key thing. Also, I felt like that when stuff was talking about sex and everything else, especially in the church, it was almost like, don't do it. Wait till marriage. And then it was like, even if you had sex, you can still repent and be a spiritual virgin.
Right.
But it's not as good as being a physical one. So there's like redemption and hope, but also shame on that same conversation with spiritual virginity.
Right.
So talking about so that's kind of my experience as far as in the church, and even a little bit into like that concept of purity culture. But again, like I never read dating books. I never read any kind of Christian literature that talked about dating, because again, I was a late bloomer in that thing. So what was your experience, and how did purity culture what did you hear from that thing, and how did that shape you and your understanding of sex?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to say that for me, I'm a heterosexual, cisgender, white, middle class, trauma-free female. Female's the only like title of less privilege that I have. So all my experiences are coming through that type of lens. But I would say it was probably similar to yours, that you're hearing this message of men being these sex-craved animal type creatures, and we are hearing the same thing in the girls group. And I think what a lot of people, either you were sexually active or you weren't, or kind of felt somewhere in between, no matter what, you were scared about what was going on with the other gender. You were scared that you were a stumbling block, or you were causing them to sin, or, you know, whatever that may be for whatever type of personality you had. I think we were on the opposite end in fear, you know, almost.
Yeah.
I think a big message, obviously, with the purity culture was that promoting this abstinence until marriage it was like this guarantee that if you stuck on this one track, it would lead to this blissful and fulfilling sex life. Like if you stayed right on that track, it would, like, that, it was a guarantee. And, you know, huge emphasis on modesty for females. Not something I ever heard directed towards males. Not something that I feel like was ever put on any of my, I have, you know, two brothers, not something that I ever had conversations with them about. I was having conversations with my dad all the time about what I was wearing. It was never something that was brought up between my dad and my brothers, you know?
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
and kind of let's kind of pause right there because
yeah.
I know like again, you know, we both went to the same church camp and we've worked
Hmm.
at the same church camp. And there was always one thing that bothered me, which was always the talk,
Yeah.
which was, and I can remember like there'd be times where I'd be sitting with the director and we're sitting in the dining room and all of a sudden there's like this flood of women coming into the dining room and I'm thinking what the heck is going on, and then you know I hear about the three B's.
Yep.
I don't want to see your boobs, belly, and butt.
Hmm.
um and it bothered me to some point because I never really thought that what the ladies were wearing was always something that was tempting me to do something, or to like I don't know, it wasn't like the full moon that was going to turn me into a werewolf or this like
Right.
sexual Neanderthal. You know, I'll just like I like using that word because it's funny.
Yeah.
um
It wasn't
but
turning a button all of a
I mean,
sudden.
but at the same time, you know, when I think about the list where everyone gets the list of before you go to camp, here's the
Right.
thing. And I mean, I understood like, you know, don't wear these things. These are things permitted. These things aren't permitted. But at the same time, it's like, well, I understand, you know, guys not wearing a Speedo, you know, because I don't want to see that. And I'm sure no one wants to see that. And no one wants to see me in a Speedo. At the same time, you know, I understood like if a female was wearing a bikini, you know, okay, you know, put a dark color shirt on. Like I got that. The thing that really bothered me was always the thing about the spaghetti strap tank tops or
Hmm.
the shorts that were shorter than fingertip. Because
Yeah.
again, like me, when I started shopping for myself in high school, I used to shop at like Old Navy and Pacific Sunwear. And when I looked at the women's clothes there, that was just kind of the style.
Right.
And sometimes I'd always get frustrated because I'm like, well, what are these girls supposed to wear? Like guy
Right.
clothes? And I
Hmm.
think eventually when you got to almost the mid 2000s, where you now have guys who are wearing skinny jeans
Yeah.
or wearing women's jeans
Right.
or even wearing shirts that are intentionally wear shirts that are a little bit tighter or more form fitting for them so you can see their muscles and
Right.
everything else. You know, for me I feel like, well, why is that okay but everything else was not? And
Right.
again, and I mean, and my whole point was that is like, you know, if any guy who's really obsessing over someone of the opposite sex, it doesn't matter if they're in a t-shirt and jeans or in their short shorts and a tank top,
Right.
they're going to be thinking those thoughts regardless
Right.
of what the clothing's wear. So that was something that I felt bothered me, and I think it's great that you said that. It was like, you know, almost I would almost like a double standard in some ways, because it's like, well, you can't, he's like, you know, your brothers can wear whatever they want, but or even if they did wear like the short like 70s basketball shorts,
It was
it's
funny.
funny, it's
It's a
funny,
joke.
like haha,
Yeah.
it's a joke.
Right.
Where if you're wearing the same type of shorts, it's like, oh, you're not being modest.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think I've had conversations with, well, one of our mutual friends actually recently. We were talking about how eerily close this purity culture and victim shaming are, of, you know, this idea of don't wear anything that would cause your brother to stumble is essentially the same thing as when we say, well, what was she wearing when she was raped? I mean,
Hmm.
it's putting all of the responsibility on the female and no responsibility on men.
Yeah, and I'd agree with you with that, because again, it's not, it's almost like because you wore sweatpants that said juicy on the back or
Yeah.
something, that was the only thing that needed to happen for a male to lose control over himself,
Mhm.
to act upon these sinful thoughts.
Right.
And but it's not his fault, it's the lady's fault,
It's her fault. Yeah.
which I feel is wrong in a lot of ways. So I'm glad you kind of brought that up as
Yeah.
far as those experiences. You did bring up something that I thought was interesting. You talked about this idea that if you abstain until marriage,
Hmm.
and then once you get married, then you're going to have this great happy
Mm.
fulfilled life, like sex
Yeah.
life in some
Yeah.
ways. Have you ever had the experience where not only was it that you're going to have this great fulfilling sex life, but that if you abstain, that not only your sex life is going to be great, but just life in general is going to be great. Like it's almost like there's a fulfillment or a completion by living out this track. Did you ever feel
Yeah.
that pressure? Because I know I've heard some people say that has been the case for them, but I'm not sure if that was particularly your experience.
Yeah. And I don't know how much of that is church culture, but also I feel like in my brain, it kind of aligns with American society and specifically for females, lining up with this idea that marriage, getting married, and being a virgin when you're married, like a true, actual physical virgin, not
Yeah, not a
redeemed,
spiritual one.
um, you hand over your purity ring when you get married. You're actually wearing a white dress. That is like the pinnacle of your life. Like that's what your whole life is building towards.
Yeah, not the that's interesting that you bring that up. Just with even just as a someone who does film and writes, just the symbolic nature of that.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yeah.
it's almost like the stereotypical like Disney cartoon
Oh, for
where
sure.
the happily ever after, but you don't get to see
Right. You don't
what's
see the happily
next.
ever
You
after.
don't
Yeah,
you
I'm
don't
already having
see
those conversations with my daughter. Like, this is not all that your life is about, is finding your one true love.
Yeah. And so it's interesting when you see that. And I think kind of with that being said, how was that experience for you? You had the moment, you got married. Now it's like the floodgates have opened, and now
Mhm.
the thing that you were told you cannot do, you can now do. Was it, you know, as everyone said, like, man, it's going to be so like it's going to be fireworks and
Yeah.
picnics and everything else, going to be this great experience. Was that your experience?
No, not
Well,
at
before, well,
all.
I mean, I joke because when Laura and I got married, we got married, we drove to the hotel right next to the airport so we can go on our cruise.
Hmm.
And it definitely was not our experience. And a lot of it was because when we checked in, some kid pulled the fire alarm,
Oh, God.
and the fire alarm kept going off. And even though there was like 3 fire trucks out there, it would go off and then it'd go back on. It's like they could not figure out why it kept going off. So literally, like, this is how sad it was. It was the Olympics. It was the Olympics in China. So we're laying in bed and we're watching the women's marathon start. And we watched that entire thing till it was over, like almost an hour. And every time it's like, oh, is it done? Can we
Nope.
actually can we have sex now because it's done?
Right.
And then, but I mean, but when I think about that, I think a lot of people's experiences is you get to that point where you're thinking, oh, it's going to be this great, wonderful, like beautiful thing, and then all of a sudden it just becomes this great awkward,
Yeah.
like almost like the alarm's going off, or you may be doing something but then you feel uncomfortable, so then it's like it
Yes.
just didn't really mesh well. It just seemed like what we were promised was what was the hype was definitely overhyped.
Definitely overhyped. Yeah. I think that's, I mean, it takes years to get to where you can communicate well enough with your partner, I think, to be able to figure things out. It in exactly what you said, it's awkward. And I think that is across the board, whether you're having sex before you're married or not, it's going to be weird and you're trying to figure things out, but to promote it and market it as if you do it exactly how we tell you to do it, every single person fits in this one mold and it's going
Yeah.
to be perfect.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think that's the case with everything. I remember I had a friend who, again, a church friend who she ended up having sex with her boyfriend while she was still in high school, and the first thing she told me was, Scott, don't do it. It was the most awkward thing ever. And I can remember at camp, there was a guy when I was a camper who said him and his prom date, they had sex, and he said, don't do it. It was horrible. It was the worst. And it was just like, but in my mind, I'm thinking, well, because, you didn't wait till marriage. That's why it wasn't
right.
Good.
Right.
So it almost kind of cemented that belief
Yeah.
in some way. Well, yeah, your experiences were bad because, I mean, granted, I don't think everyone's experience has a fire alarm going off throughout the night and you can't get sleep at all to catch your flight the next day. But I mean, it is. And I mean, and I think it does. And I mean, I think it goes back to communication.
Yeah.
Just like as a counselor, I tell my clients who are doing marriage counseling or premarital counseling that everything you do, from personality issues to buying a house to finances to where you're going to go spend the holidays at, even sex, all of it has to be communication. That has to be the key thing.
Yeah.
And I think even now, I've been married for 12 years. And I think now we finally have gotten to a point where there could be communication. I think at the same way, I think for some people, there was that idea of trying to get that subconscious in your thing that kind of told you that, ooh, this is bad, because I think that's what you were always taught, was that it's bad. If you do it outside of, outside of marriage, everything's bad. So even when you do have the floodgates, you've been told this is wrong, this is bad for so long. It's like, okay, well, you kind of almost like second guess yourself.
Yeah. Or it's hard to flip that switch all of a sudden.
Yeah.
This is okay now. Yeah. I definitely had friends who had that experience. I don't necessarily feel like that was so much my experience where I was fighting those messages of like, you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing. But I definitely had other messages that I feel like I was fighting as soon as we got married and were having sex. Like, I definitely feel like there were other things that I was fighting with, and still continue to have to work through that, what I would say were lies or biblical views, and I'm using air quotes with that were taught in the church that I don't necessarily believe to be true.
Like what, for an example, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah. Definitely one of the things that I was taught was, well, we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but like sex is beautiful, but only in the context of heterosexual marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And while I think that is true and can be true, I think that you also, you, like we've mentioned, you have to work at it, you have to communicate, but I think that can discount anyone who is not in a heterosexual marriage, anyone who has had experiences of really great and beautiful sex outside of marriage. I think that makes implications about unplanned pregnancies and those not being beautiful or part of God's plan.
Even. And yeah, and that's like that's a whole nother can of worms or topics to talk about. And that's something that may have to be discussed at a later time, because we can go spend hours on that.
Right.
But I think what it boils down to is, when it comes to experiences, I think for me personally, I don't necessarily think that, hey, I would have been fine if I had sex outside of marriage. For me, I think there's I think there's just a psychological thing, because then if I did have any bad experiences, or I've had trust issues or something that may have come from my experiences, and not everyone would have those experiences, then, that's stuff I'm bringing into this marriage, which I think may be kind of what was, I think there was always those messages or those cheesy Christian skits where it's like, I have a heart, and someone rips it in half, and then someone rips that
Right.
heart, and then next thing you know, it's like, oh, I have a husband, but I only have this little tiny tip of a piece of paper to give to you. Like,
Right.
I don't think that's very realistic at all. What I do
No.
think is, I think it's just the baggage that can come with that. And I think,
Right.
I think even just not necessarily my own baggage, but even just people I've counseled, they've come with a lot of baggage from decisions they've made, or even just being with the wrong partner. Even
Yeah.
those who were abstained, first time they had sex was when they were married, but then their partner was very, controlling, narcissistic. And then, so
Right.
now that they're in this other relationship, they get remarried. And now it's like some of the hesitancies was, oh, well, I'm still kind of struggling with this sex because of the baggage I've had with the previous partner. And so I
Right.
see that it's a lot of it has to do with experience, and obviously the idea of how we are taught. And even when we look at scripture, I don't necessarily see teachings of sex being bad.
Right.
I mean, occasionally you do, like the story in, well, as one of the stories in Genesis, where the like the one woman's husband died, so the brother has to impregnate her so she can have a son, and he spills his seed on the floor, and then God kills him.
Right.
Like okay, that's. But I think we can misconstrue that story. But it's like, we see that sex is a beautiful thing, something that God designed. Obviously, he told Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply, and even with that,
Yeah.
I know some church traditions, some may very conservative than the traditions that we may have grown up in, where they view that sex is only for making babies.
Right.
Then that's the only time anybody can have sex, is for baby making, and not for enjoying your partner or communication or any of those things. It's like,
Yeah.
basically, it's like your whole purpose is to get married and to pop out babies, and
Yep.
that is the extent of your sexuality.
Yeah.
um so with all that being said, what conversations are you having, or how are you approaching to take everything, your experiences that you've had when it came to the topic of sex being communicated in a Christian family or in a church setting, and how are you going to, what are some things that you think you might kind of keep from your experience, and what are some things that you may do differently when it comes to teaching your kids about
Yeah.
sex?
Yeah. Um, well, I feel like this kind of relates a little bit still back to this idea that I mentioned of like having these um, ideas taught to me, or things that were said in the church that I'm still kind of working through. I've got a couple that come to mind. One was I probably a little bit related to the modesty culture, was that females are in charge of the sexual relationship. And I think that, I don't know if that was like unique to my experience, like that was
Mm.
just like unique to my parents kind of communicating that, but I feel like it was an overarching theme of like the female is in charge because the man can't be in charge.
Mm.
And so I think part of that I would like to keep and pass along to my kids is this idea that, yeah, females are in charge of their sexuality and in charge of their body, but the rest I toss. Men are not being held responsible for their actions. It's always all about how the woman dresses. The woman got herself pregnant. If there's infidelity on the men's side, it's because his wife wasn't doing her part to keep herself up.
Mm. Mm.
Um, and I think it also encourages or assumes that women don't have sexual desires of their own, that they maybe even need to manage. It's skipping over that women are sexual beings at all.
Yeah, and you bring up a very, I mean, I think that when you talk about your experience about, women kind of being in control
Mm-hmm.
of their sexuality, um, And I mean, I think that's very key, because I think especially in, again, this wasn't my experience, but I think in like conservative experiences, it's the man. Like
Yeah.
the man is in control. Or even when we think about other religions outside of Christianity, it's usually the man is in control of your sexual destiny.
Yeah.
Which, and then again, you say, the idea of women being sexual creatures, because again, that was something that was not taught. And I want to know if it wasn't taught because, they didn't want, these pure virgin brides of Christ, um, being, turning into me, this man Neanderthal,
Right.
that
Yeah.
there's nothing. I mean, I think there's this idea of, I think if you're going to say that the women are this pure bride, well, technically the church is the bride. So the guys have to be, the equivalent, the same thing. They have to be a pure bride too for
Hmm.
Christ,
Yeah.
and I think that's core. But I think when you said that, about women embracing your sexuality, I think that's why when Sex in the City came out, why that was so shocking,
Right.
because it was like, what, women having sex and talking
Right.
about it? Like,
I didn't think they wanted
whoa.
that.
I remember, like, now, because I know there's times where Laura was like, watched the show, and I've watched a couple episodes with her, and I'm just like, this is so shocking. I'm thinking about it, but at the time, I guess it was like, it was very shocking to hear
Yeah.
that, or, or even just seeing a woman being portrayed as someone who is kind of making the moves
Yeah.
towards that sexual intimacy.
Yeah.
Like Laura and I, we watched the movie What Women Want, which is kind of like What
Hmm.
Men Want, except
Hmm.
it was with what's her name, Tamaria, I can't think of her name now, but she was the lead character, and she was like the Mel Gibson character in a way, and it was
Yeah.
just like, oh, like, but I mean, she's very commanding, and it's like, oh wow, like someone in a powerful role, like making those moves, like that's shocking. Some
Right.
people would be like, oh, like that's what we're trying to fight against. We don't want our women turning into that, and it's like,
Right. Well,
well,
how do you control it when you're say admitting that both parties are sexual beings? How do you control that? How do you make people stay abstinent? You can't do it. So you have to say, all right, this party is the ones that we can't control.
mhm,
These Neanderthals,
yeah,
the females are responsible. You're the red light, green light for
the red light,
making
green light,
sure
yeah.
making sure everything stays how it is.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point, Kaylee, because I do, like, I mentioned it is like a double standard in some cases in spirituality, where it's this or that, and it's like, well, no, we're both accountable for
Hmm.
our actions, for
Yeah.
everything, and I think that's very important. So I know that was one of the things you're going to teach your kids, and
Yeah.
I really started to unpack that. So what was the other thing that you
Um,
that you may do differently or kind of keep the same?
something that, well, I think something that I was definitely handed was masturbation is wrong always across the
Mm,
board, no matter what. And as the longer I've been married and the more that conversations I have, for me, I feel like sexual exploration is necessary if you are wanting to be able to communicate your wants and needs with your partner.
hmm.
And I think when you look at it as in terms of like having a manual, how are you going to communicate to your partner if you haven't even read the manual yourself? How can you communicate um, what you want or what you like or anything like that? And this is another one of those things where I think it's favored towards men because 30% of women can't even orgasm from a vaginal penetration, from having sex alone. There's
Hmm.
most women can't orgasm from that. So the other 70% are just expected to know and communicate without any education. And something that I think is mind blowing that we're saying, no, absolutely not. You can't figure this out. You just have to guess.
Hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think kind of the I'm kind of curious if one of the reasons why that's such a big deal is because anytime when you think about masturbation, usually porn always kind of gets thrown into the
Yeah.
equation. And I think that's kind of been a big thing. I know, especially being a guy and even being a counselor, hearing stories of guys who struggled with, the shame of pornography and how that has affected their view of women in
Mm-hmm.
some ways. And so I get that, but at the same time I think you're right in a way, because it's like, well, again, it goes back to communication, because it's like, if you have a tool, if I have a tool but then I don't know how to use it, then it's just going to, then how am I going to fix anything? How am I going
Right.
to, if I have a socket wrench but I don't know how to use it, then how am I ever going to get my kid's training wheels off his bike?
How are you going to tell somebody else to use the tool?
Exactly. I mean, it's the same thing, like, with me, with my video editing software, and especially with this pandemic, teaching people how to use streaming software,
Right.
how to use it, what are the, if I tell them, here's how you use it. And if you run into any problems, here's how you can troubleshoot these problems. When I do that, then I don't have to worry about it, because they can take care of that.
Right.
I mean, I think even in, when it comes to your partner, and especially with different experiences, even the idea of exploration was kind of a thing that you didn't do. It was just almost
Naughty.
like,
Very
I mean,
bad.
oh yeah, well,
Yeah.
yeah, naughty, but even at the same time, like, even if you think about, you know, I mean, like, if it's like, okay, well, the only way I can have sex is the missionary position, and that
Right.
is it,
Mm-hmm.
because everything else is too taboo, or I may be pushing a boundary. And, and I think maybe at first, like, maybe that's just kind of what people are comfortable with,
Right.
especially when you have two
Yeah.
people who grew up in the church. It's like, okay,
Right.
that's it. But then I think as we get older, then, and I think that's why I always hear people say, like, oh yeah, when you're 50, 60, or 70, then, your sex life is really good, because again, you've communicated with your partner, and
Yeah.
especially as your body changes or anything else, you start to understand, like, okay, here's that. And you're finding new ways to, you know, stimulate your partner, and for your partner to stimulate you, to be able to have this joyous, loving, romantic sex life.
Right.
Which I believe, I mean, I remember the one thing, I think the only good thing I heard from premarital counseling when I went through it is, sex is a thing that can either rip your marriage apart, or it's something that can really strengthen it and make it solid. And I think
Mm-hmm.
even when you are having those communications with your partner and able to do those things, then yeah, you're going to have kind of a stronger sex life. But then even in that, you're going to have a stronger marriage. And I remember,
Right.
and I don't know if, did you ever have a class with Dr. Shively at
I
Anderson?
didn't. No.
Okay. I remember it was introduction to ministry, and we are talking about something, and I don't know, we are talking about, relationships and marriage, and church
Mm-hmm.
life and ministry. And I remember, like, it was time for us to go. And I remember the one time he says, you know what, keep your marriage alive, keep it sexy. And he was like, I mean, he's 70, I think he was like 72 at this point. And
Yeah.
I'm just like, and I'm agreeing with him, but at the same time, I was kind of like, you're in your 70s and you're telling me to keep it sexy, which means that you're probably saying, hey, I keep it sexy in my relationship. And it's like, and that was something that I was starting to have like a weird,
Yeah.
like, but I mean, I think at the same point, he was right. You try to have those moments, because it is going to make your marriage stronger.
Yeah.
And I think it's not only important just to say, I mean, even if I'm just like, hey, let's try this or try this new thing, and Laura's not ready for it, then I'm not going to force that, because again,
Right.
I have to respect her boundaries and what she's comfortable with. And then eventually, if she's open to that, then we can go. And I think that's
Right.
kind of the same thing. And I think that's always key.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I would agree with you on that, about as far as, and yeah, that's a very interesting thing when it comes to, self-satisfaction or masturbation. And I mean, geez, because I mean, and I think that's always the strange thing too, because when we look at the Bible and Scripture, at least I know from my experience, it was always like, well, don't do it,
Right.
but you never really got the reasons why or why
Right.
this was the better way,
Right.
and it was like you were told and you were given statistics, but you were never given like a good reflection on the
Yeah.
word. I mean,
Well, I
and
think exactly what you said earlier, it's always connected to porn.
mhm.
And for some reason the church can't have those two things separate. They can't, it also can't be something that you share with your partner,
Mm-hmm.
like which and it's also never something that is talked about in reference to people like using it as a stepping stone for people who have sexual or emotional trauma either, which
Mm.
I think it can be.
That's I think that's a good point too. Yeah, I think that's a very yeah, I'd agree with you on that. Just from stuff I've read as a counselor about sexual trauma and how do you have a good sex life when you have that trauma behind you. I
Right.
think there
Yeah.
are some hiccups with that. So, how do you get to that? How do you get to that? How do you get to that step, or what are the steps you need to take to be able to help use it as a therapy tool in a way
Right.
to
A
kind of help
healing
and
stepping stone.
healing and
Yeah.
strengthening your relationship with your partner as well. I think
Right.
those are key things. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Trust exercise.
Mhm.
I don't know.
Yeah. Good stuff. So, is there anything else we haven't covered yet that you wanted to still talk about on this topic of church and sex before we start to wrap things up?
Yes, there are a couple of things. um, well, you had mentioned um, maybe a little or kind of alluded to like things that I would maybe even want to pass along to my kids.
Yes. Hmm.
Um, and I think there are definitely several things from my experience um, that I feel like I'm still processing through, which I already mentioned,
Yeah.
but more so talking like starting to talk early. Like you mentioned that set you like you were kind of a late bloomer.
Hmm.
I like talking in fifth grade with me was honestly kind of late. I already had friends telling me about sex and I already had crushes on boys. And so for us starting to talk, like we've already had conversations with our kids
Hmm.
who are almost 6 and 4
Yeah.
about sex and not even just trying to promote healthy sexual lives for them in the future, but the statistics on sexual abuse are absurd with children.
Hmm.
And so like already having those conversations about boundaries
Hmm.
and setting boundaries and respecting boundaries
Yeah.
with our kids. You know, we have one child that is very physical, wants to be touched and held all the time. The other one sometimes doesn't even want a good night hug.
Hmm.
And so I think their personalities have helped us to be able to teach both of them about setting and respecting boundaries.
Yeah, and I think that's key because even when I think about like where my daughter is at, she's 2. There's days where she wants to be held, she wants to
Mm-hmm.
give daddy kisses on the mouth, and then there's other times where I'll say, "Hey, do you want to give daddy a hug?" And she's like, "Uh-uh."
Yeah.
And and I think as a parent, you're like, "No," it's very easy to say,
Like be
"No, kid, I'm
offended.
your dad. You give me
Right.
a hug." Or I'm going to give you a hug, even though you say no. But at the same time, I'm like, okay, that's something that's innocent. But then, you know, how am I going to? But I think in some ways, that's also kind of where they're starting to understand boundaries. They're
Yeah.
understanding
Yeah.
like, I like this, I don't like that. So when
Yeah.
you have someone who's a trusted adult or a figure who's saying no, and even though it's not a violation of their sexuality, but it
Right.
is a violation of their boundaries. And
Yeah.
if I am doing that, then how are they going to build good coping boundary
Yeah.
methods?
They can't
Um,
they're we're teaching them that they can't trust their instincts.
Mm.
And even if that is, like you're saying, even if it's a safe person, their parent or
Yeah.
grandparent or whomever, we really want them to be able to learn to trust what their body and what their emotions are telling them,
Mm-hmm.
so that in the future they can make better, really good decisions about physical boundaries. And I know, obviously that when you're saying, okay, let's say goodbye to this person, we're going to be respectful and give them a hug or a kiss or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
You can, and they say no, you can see that as an act of defiance. But for me, there's so many other things, other areas that I can teach. They don't get a choice about brushing their teeth.
Mm-hmm.
They don't get to choose what time they go to bed.
Yeah.
There's so many other areas that I can enforce following the rules and being respectful of adults.
Mm-hmm.
That's one area where it has always been with our kids. It's your body. You get to make the choice about who touches it, for how long, whatever. That's your choice.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's great. I think that's definitely a step in the right direction, just as far as like just young children. Cause I have young children, you have young children. So it's like where, when Melissa, she's talking about Michael, who's 11. So it's like, oh, okay. So he's on a whole different playing field now than Peter is, So yeah, I mean, and I guess, is there anything else you would use to kind of teach, that you do differently to kind of teach your kids?
Well, we're definitely in this phase where both our kids are curious. So acknowledging all types of sexual, romantic relationships, having a lot of both our kids love to read. So a lot of the information that we definitely want them to be around different people, but especially right now with Corona, we do a lot of reading and introducing them to other ideas, because what they experience is a heterosexual marriage between cisgender people. So offering them different views of this is how someone else chooses to live their life. This is another option of how someone chooses to live their life. Another big thing is using anatomically correct terms when we're talking about their body parts, so that they don't experience shame around having a vagina, having boobs, having a penis. They use those words freely, so they're not feeling shame or guilt or embarrassment.
And that's something that we've been doing here too. It's very weird when my daughter goes, Daddy has a penis, Peter has a penis, and then she'll say she has a vagina, or she'll say she has a vulva.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, okay. Where, growing up, it was always like, pee-pee. Like everybody had a pee-pee, or everyone had private parts, but you never acknowledged what it actually was. So obviously in 5th grade, when the lady's saying, okay, what's the male sex organ? And I'm like,
right.
And I'm like, feel embarrassed about it, but it's like, that's what
but I don't want their experience. I don't want their experience to be like, I didn't know what a clitoris was until I was married. And how that's all of it. That's the whole thing for females. So it's like, how can you expect them to have these blissful, amazing sex lives if they don't even know what body parts they have or how to use them? And not like we're, teaching them those things now, but to start talking through what different things can do, what their body parts are, and to not have shame and guilt around those things.
Yeah.
Or trying to cover everything up because somebody else is lusting after them.
Yeah, which again, it's not a problem on their part. It's a problem on the person who's lusting.
Right. Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, so this has been wonderful. I've definitely been enjoying this conversation, Kaylee. Yeah, I think we've kind of covered everything that we're trying to cover here. And I know there's some other stuff that we can really get into, but obviously we don't have all the time in the world to do that. But Kaylee, thank you so much for joining me back on my show. It's been way too long. I've been enjoying your thoughts, and good luck you said in 2 weeks you're going to be.
Oh, hopefully. A little over 2 weeks is when I'm due, and both the other ones were right on their due dates. So I was hoping to go early, but probably not.
Well,
That's okay.
let's just hope Nick doesn't have to do the
Deliver this
delivery
one.
at the house or in a car or on a boat on Lake Erie or wherever
Oh
you're
my goodness, I know. We're hoping to make it to the hospital this
All
time.
right. Well, everybody, again, thank you so much for joining us on the Scott Stedman podcast. Feel free to like, share, and subscribe. Feel free to leave a review if you've enjoyed this podcast. And again, we like to hear what you think. What are your thoughts about sex in church? What was your experience? You can feel free to send me an email, or you can find that on my website, thescottstedman.com. You can write there in the comment section or even on the Facebook page, the official Scott Stedman podcast. Definitely want to chat with you and hear all about your experiences and what you thought about this episode. And again, Kaylee, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
And guys, I hope you have a wonderful, good rest of your week, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.